My first wife, Pam, and I were married in Tokyo. It's a long story. The short version is that we were both foreign students who met in Japan and decided 6 months later to get married there. Actually, it was Pam who kept insisting that we marry while still abroad. I had serious qualms about that. I felt strongly that it would be far better to wait until we returned to the US, where we would meet each other's family, finish our studies, and only then get married. We debated this for weeks, but in the end, Pam got her way. When I asked her why it was so important that we get married so far from our families, Pam would answer vaguely that her mother was, as she put it, complicated, and she didn't want her in any way involved. In retrospect, I can now see that this should have been all the more reason for me to want to visit and meet her family. But I was young then, and such an obvious point just didn't click into place. Instead, we had a small wedding led by a Roman Catholic priest from New Jersey with a few fellow students attending. At first, I saw no connection when, some weeks later, Pam suggested that we go to see the movie The Godfather, which had just come out. We took our seats in the crowded theater, popcorn in hand, as the lights dimmed and the haunting theme music rose in the darkness. From that moment forward, the movie had me in its grip. I was mesmerized and horrified both at once. I sat riveted as Don Corleone, the Godfather, played of course by Marlon Brando, slipped away from his daughter's wedding to meet with a man who was asking a favor. The man's daughter had been attacked and raped, and he wanted the man who had done this dealt with, in his words. Marlon Brando listened attentively, then leaned forward, and in the slow, gravelly voice that Brando adopted for the movie and which was so widely imitated from then on, he said, "You know, my friend, in all these years, you have never come to me. You have never wanted to be my friend. You have never come to me for a favor. You have never called me Godfather. And now you do come to me. You ask me to do this thing. You ask me to commit murder of this scumbag who has assaulted your daughter. And I will do it for you. But you need to know that there will come a time. It may not be soon. It may not be for years. But there will come a time when I will ask a favor of you too. I hope you understand that." Slowly, the man nods. He then takes Don Corleone's hand in his own and bends down to kiss his ring. "Yes, Godfather," he says, "I understand." It was then, in the brief pause as this scene shifted to another, that Pam leaned over to me in the darkness and whispered, "That's what my mother's family had to deal with. It's why I wanted you to see this movie." And it was at that point that I really should have worried about the family I was marrying into. It was only when we finally returned to America and I discovered to my great relief that not only were my wife's family not linked to the mafia, but my new mother-in-law who did turn out to be complicated, far more opinionated, controlling, and just plain angry than Pam had ever let on, was Sicilian. And avoiding ties to the mafia had been one of the major reasons her family had come to this country. She well knew how easily its tangled tentacles of favors and obligations could draw you in and make you a party to its criminal network. Her family had done all they could to keep apart from those ties, because if there was one thing those criminal families knew and appreciated before all else, before even money, it was the power of connections, the necessity to build a network, This was basic. It was essential to everything they did. Without those connections, they had nothing. The mysterious power of connections, the deeply binding force of interwoven ties. This is something even criminals know, the smartest among them at least. They know it and they value it, and they work at it. The most powerful criminal organizations cultivate those ties constantly. They never stop. They are always shoring up their network, perpetually extending the number and strength of their link to others. And when they do this, the action is profoundly disturbing. That's because they are using one of the most powerful human needs, the need for connection and belonging, to manipulate and control others to a sinister end. And yet the goal of forming ties is actually a good one. In fact, it's absolutely necessary. Is it possible then that we might actually learn something from such criminals? Believe it or not, this is the point of Jesus's parable today. And what a strange parable it is. I mean, here we have a story of a man who is about to be fired from his job as a manager for squandering his employer's property. Knowing that, as it is, no one will now hire him, the dishonest manager hatches a plan. He calls together all those who owe money to his employer, and one by one, he cuts a deal with them. He agrees to dramatically lower their bill so that and so manages to make friends with them while further cheating the man he works for. He truly is despicable. And yet, what does this employer do when he finds out? Does he rage at him or even take him to court? No, not at all. Instead, his employer actually praises him for his wisdom in seeing his way out of what was a major problem for him by building a network of friendship through ties and connections, something he himself clearly values too. And what does Jesus hold up as a moral of this story? It's this, that we actually have something to learn from this disreputable manager. And what is that? Is it that we should cheat our employers? Obviously not. No, it's this, the power of connections, the absolute necessity of networks. This is what Jesus wants us to see. For as Jesus says, quote, the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light, unquote. In other words, as the mafia makes clear, when it comes to building connections, those who are criminal and corrupt are often far better at forming the ties to help them in their work than those of us who work for the good. In this one matter, then, those who make a career of being dishonest can be more astute than we are. We need to be humble enough to recognize this and learn from them. And it's true, you know, all too often, spiritual people can focus far more time on their own private relationship with God than on building strong networks with others around them or in forming ties within their surrounding community. And yet, the more a church does this, the more it does form those community ties, the stronger it becomes. The more it attracts people to it, the more it is able to help those in need. And of course, we're all aware that we need to reach out to individuals. But what about other organizations or to whole neighborhoods? What Jesus is telling us then is that we need to think of the church in a somewhat different way than I believe many of us do, myself included. We need to come to understand that we, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church of Gilroy, California, are not a freestanding, independent structure. We are a tree rooted within a larger community. We are rooted in the county, the city, and the neighborhood that surrounds us. And like a tree, we will live or die by how far those roots extend. We need to reach out to form ties with our neighbors, to support local efforts, to link up with city and county groups who are helping others. We need to build connections. This is vital information, and I'm grateful to this parable for pointing it out to me. Many commentators see this parable as by far the most confusing and troubling of all the stories that Jesus tells, but I don't agree. I don't see it as either confusing or troubling. To me, it seems quite clear. We are all interconnected after all. We are interconnected on many levels, not only as individuals, but as institutions too. Just because some criminals or corrupt politicians seem to have learned this lesson better than we have, doesn't mean that we can't learn it also. Only in our case, we need to use this basic truth for good, not ill. We'll use it to build up the church of God and strengthen our ties to those in need. I, for one, think this time that we as a church looked into this. How about you? Amen.